Well, welcome everyone. So excited to be here to talk with an author I've admired for a very long time, and I'm gonna introduce him, and then he's gonna read from his latest novel, Rednecks. But I think the introduction could be, man, you are a really good writer,
Oh,
and that would be enough. But I do have a few more details. By the way, I'm Jeffrey Dale Lofton, and I'm an author as well, and just excited to be here to be in conversation with Taylor. He is the recipient of the Montana Prize in Fiction and the Rash Award, a three-time finalist for the Southern Book Prize until this week, and now he is a four-time finalist for the Southern Book Prize. And we'll see how that goes. Cross your fingers and vote for him. He was also named Georgia Author of the Year for Literary Fiction. And he's the author of a short story collection and 6 novels, Fallen Land, The River of Kings, Gods of Howell Mountain, Pride of Eden, Wingwalkers, and now Rednecks. He lives in Savannah, Georgia, and runs a custom motorcycle publication, Bikebound. Welcome, Taylor.
thank you so much, Jeffrey, for having me, and thank you all for coming. I thought I'd start off by reading just a little bit from the book. I thought I'd read the prologue, which kind of gives us a good background of the world of the time, which is West Virginia, 1921, in the coal fields. And this book takes place during the struggles as miners try to unionize. They work beneath the pale flames of carbide headlamps. Some swing picks into the face, hewing the coal straight from the seam, while others shovel the black rubble into iron carts. All crouch like boxers in this shoulder-high chamber, which they call a room. They work dark to dark in this mine, descending before daylight touches the deep coal camp hollers where they live, and surfacing 10 hours later, soot-faced as chimney sweeps, the last glow of dusk to greet them. The mine cars are drawn to the surface by mules born underground, animals who only know darkness, like some cave species, pulling their trains of coal through swinging trapdoors attended by 10-year-old boys who curse and sweet-talk them in turn, boys they kick into the wall when they like. All breathe a black dust, explosive, which swirls through the cramped, yellowy light. The pickers and shovelers work with red bandanas knotted over their faces, the cotton black fogged over their noses and mouths. Perhaps it's an inadvertent spark from a miner's pick, striking an unseen shard of flint. Perhaps a pocket of methane has just exhaled from the strata, freed after eons. The mountain erupts. A train of fire bores through the tunnels and shafts and rooms. Men are burned alive, boys buried underground. A great plume of ash blows from the mouth of the mine and rolls skyward, seen for miles. The morning papers will read, 21 killed in mine blast. The country will hardly register the news. Such headlines are frequent, far removed from the reading public, like earthquakes or eruptions on far sides of the world. Outside the drift mouth, 2 miners lie on their bellies, heaving, their hands atop their heads. They look at each other, red-eyed, dizzied, ears awine. The world blows around them, dust and smoke and red meteors of coal. Everything clad in a pail of ash, thick and woolly. Tonight the coal camp will wail with death. One raises his head. Told you see blow, ain't I? This wouldn't never happen at no union mine. We'd have them vent shafts we asked for. The other miner looks over his shoulder, eyes wild, as if the devil might be standing behind him, marking their words. He hisses through his teeth. Hush with that talk, man. You're like to get us killed.
Thank you. Thanks for reading that for us. You do such a good job of sort of creating this world where these men and their families, you say that it's cramped and yellow, and you really do paint the picture of a really cramped life, not just while they're in the mine, but the way that they're suppressed and they're not allowed to have rights, as a union would allow them. I wanted to begin by talking about the cover of the book. I love covers of books as a way into a story. And this one I can only imagine it looks like a photograph of maybe Blair Mountain, which is where this is set. And I thought originally that this tear was a bullet hole, but I noticed that it doesn't go inward as a bullet hole would. The pages it's torn outward, and underneath is this very pristine red bandana, and of course the bandanas in the book are not pristine. And I'm wondering, could you tell us about the cover and how it helps us get into the story and how it represents it?
Yes, and I actually have kind of a magical thing happen with this cover, because the Mine Wars Museum in Matewan, West Virginia is a hub for me of some of the research I did and whatnot. And when I was working on the novel, I got a hold of, they publish a quarterly journal. And on the centennial of the Battle of Blair Mountain in 2021, they published a program. And I noticed that the cover artist's name was John Bush, okay? Well, my publisher is St. Martin's, and I have a previous book of mine, Pride of Eden, the cover artist was Jonathan Bush. So I thought it's not an uncommon name, so surely they're not the same person. It turns out that John Bush, the cover artist who works at St. Martin's, is best friends with the creative director of the West Virginia Mine Wars Museum, and it is the same person.
Wow.
So crazily enough, when they asked me for kind of a mood board or some images that I thought might inspire the cover, I didn't know that Jonathan Bush was going to do it. I literally sent him pictures of his own, St. Martin's pictures of his own work. But I love this idea. I had seen something similar in a journal they'd done that was bullet holes. And I like the idea that this is a story that has absolutely been suppressed, and it is one of the biggest, to me, buried stories in American history. This is about an uprising of miners in 1921, when 10,000 coal miners rose up against the coal companies. 1 million rounds were fired on American soil. Bombs were dropped on American soil in 1921 in West Virginia, and almost no one has heard of it. And so the idea, I think, and it also incorporates as the title an alternative origin story of what we think of as redneck, which if you ask anyone, they say, sunburn on the back of the neck, that's what the origin is. And while that is true, scholars now say that the word really jumped into broader use during the Mine Wars era, and the miners wore red bandanas around their necks, and people called them rednecks. So the idea was like this history kind of punching out, being unburied, and it originally, and one revision was more a bullet hole, and two things happened. One, I didn't want it to necessarily have that connotation, and I did have a bookstore friend that said, if you want to put, I think a lot of bookstores don't want bullet holes in their front window, kind of. But I like this idea that it's more punching outward, and being torn open versus a bullet hole. But I just loved it. It was the second iteration of a cover, and of course I felt like the one perfect person in the universe to create it, since he knew all the history already.
Well, I really love it, and one of the things I wanted to talk to you about was the origin of rednecks, because I'm from rural Georgia, and this story, I knew nothing about it. It's not it's not coal country, not mine country, but the redneck does mean exactly what you said, and I loved hearing this other version of what it means to be a redneck, because it's a badge of courage in a way. But I'm curious. So on the cover, this bandana is so clean and pristine,
right?
And it's so symmetrically situated. Was there a reason for that?
I think that there was something about it that there was no reason that we really said, we didn't really discuss that part of it, but I liked something about it that there is a fleshiness to it, almost like bare flesh, like something that's been skinned or something like that, versus it being kind of dirty and cold, kind of like it's freshly revealed, kind of like an animal that's been being cleaned. And I think that was part of it, and it just had this kind of it really stands out in that way, I think, in a way. But that wasn't something that we necessarily talked about specifically for it to be clean. They kind of were like, what do you think about this? And I say, I like it or I don't. I say, if I don't, I'm much more, careful about how to say that. But
it's interesting that you mentioned this, this flesh that's been ripped open, because Dr. Moo, or Doc Moo, is he's really one of the hearts. There's several hearts in this book. Good men who try their best to do the right thing under horrible circumstances. And I understand he's also inspired by your great-grandfather, I believe.
Yes.
But at some point he says, Doc Moo observes that butchery is crude work, but he thinks of it as much neater because unlike surgery, there are no screams, no fear of death, unfeeling. He keeps, his neutral place in this conflict as long as he can. Will you talk to us about Doc Moo?
Absolutely. So it's interesting the way that books, I think sometimes we think that books are spawned and come into the world in a fairly close way to the way they're finally published, and that has not always been the case with me. Sometimes you find your way to them in strange ways, and that did happen with this book. I originally wrote this book and gave it to my editor in 2021, and it had a contemporary storyline mixed in, and he actually originally rejected it and said, I think this is too much for one book. You don't need to braid this contemporary storyline in with a historical storyline for it to have contemporary power and resonance. And at the same time, he said, I'm also really interested in this side character, this Lebanese-American physician. Now, he had no idea so my great-grandfather came over from Lebanon in 1889, I believe. He was 14 years old. He came over without his family. We're still not sure exactly how this happened. He went to medical school at the University of Kentucky and became a physician in rural Kentucky, and we share the same birthday. So my whole life, my grandmother kind of saw and implanted in me this affinity for my great-grandfather, although I never met him. He was obviously an amazing individual to come over at that age to the United States and as an immigrant at that time and to attain the stature that he did in the community. So I had wanted to write about him for years and had been assembling information from different family sources. My great aunt has traveled to Lebanon 3 times and met family members that are over there. But I didn't have the story of him. We don't know quite enough about his life. But I had put him in originally as a side character in the book as a tribute to him. So I think the mark of a great editor sometimes, and my editor just picked up. He had no idea that this was based on my great-grandfather. So he picked up on this fascinating character, and that was kind of the light bulb moment for me that, he should be at the heart of the book. And it gave me a character that had, while he was in Kentucky during this time and was the right age, he was not at Battle of Blair Mountain. So it gave me a little more freedom with the character in the book that you're closest to not be so beholden to, the historical characters in the book like Sid Hatfield and Mother Jones. Well, we know a lot about where they were when and what happened to them, and that's a little bit limiting as a fiction writer. So it gave me someone that I could have a little bit freer reign with their story and let it go where it might. And yes, to me, the Hippocratic Oath is what he's trying to hold to amid all of this, war really going on and these more and more polarization, more and more stark sides of you're either on one side or the other. And after some point, he has to kind of, make a choice. But I really imagine him as someone that's really trying to hold to the oath of do no harm and treating someone, no matter what their politics are, certainly no matter what their skin color is, no matter who they work for. And he has risen to respecting the community for doing that. But he also, at some point, has to kind of choose sides.
And he even, do no harm, and yet I noticed a moment. It's not a big moment, but a moment in which he smokes, and he acknowledges this is not good for me. but it's better than, I think I might have wrote a note, it's better than to hurt himself than to hurt others. Would you talk a little bit more about him? He's such a, and
Sure.
I'm not fascinated that he was a side character and then became, the heart of the book.
Yeah, so it started there's a part in the book where he arranges a truce. And I knew that a physician it's the 3-day the Battle of the Tug, or the 3-day battle that's in May 1921, I believe. And I knew a physician had been asked, a trusted physician that everyone kind of, both sides respected, had been asked to arrange this truce. And it meant running across the river under gunfire and holding up a white flag. It was a very dangerous thing. But I couldn't find who that physician was. But there was a large Lebanese American population in West Virginia at the time. There's still a Maronite church in Wheeling, in a pretty big population. And so it made sense for it to be him. And so he was in the book only in a couple chapters as that character. And then, yes, as I rewrote the book, he just moved. In each revision, he moved more and more kind of toward the heart of the book, I think. In terms of, the hurting himself, I think he's growing. One, Dotmu probably has similarities to my character more than some other characters I've written, simply because I have a great affinity with my great-grandfather, and I found myself imagining myself in his position, a little bit more. And he's struggling a little bit with, because all this is going on, and he's getting, he's got a little bit of a temper, which I do too. He gets heated, and he's, these are things that he's kind of struggling with a little bit. There was something else that I was trying to get through in the book, which goes back to your quote about how people think of butchery as cruel work, but it's actually very neat compared to surgery, especially trauma surgery in a battle environment. And I think sometimes we think of physicians as, because most of our experience with them is in a very antiseptic hospital room or clinic or in an office. And the reality is that both today, if you're somewhere like, Palestine or the Ukraine, or, throughout history, physicians on the ground have had to be very much in a very cruel environment, getting their hands all the way up to the, think about the Civil War physicians and that kind of thing. So there's very much a different way of looking at being a medical professional that even Dotmu's father, who had fought in the Lebanese Civil War and had been used as someone as almost a corpsman there, had kind of implanted in him, and that was something I kind of carried through the book, I guess. Because he isn't an aggressive person at all. He's very neutral, and he's a peacemaker, but he is in a very brutal environment and trying to keep a level head through a lot of that.
I was really, still talking about Dotmu, I was really surprised to find him in the book, because when I think of, that time, even, it's a century ago, but you think of that part of the world during that time as being very, really white. Not a lot of diversity. Yeah. White, yeah. Protestant. That's the dominant, in control party. In the conflict, blacks and white. What do you know what the diversity makeup was back then?
So that's one of the central myths. I think a lot of the time when people think of Appalachia, they think of white Protestant being predominantly. That's the image, especially outside of Appalachia, and that is a myth that I was directly trying to overturn with this book. The Rednecks themselves in the Miners' March, so kind of the original Rednecks, 1 in 5 was black. You had Poles, Sicilians, Hungarians, Italians, Spanish. It was a very much mixed lot, and that is very well documented. And if you even look at the photos of when the miners strike, they lose their jobs for the most part, and they're evicted from company housing, and they're living in these tent colonies. And if you look at the photos from then, it's kind of sad that it's so surprising, but you don't think of Appalachia 100 years ago having kids looking out from tents, and it's like black face, brown face, white face, kind of. They're black and white, but you can see the diversity. You have white women holding black babies and black women holding white babies for photos. Everyone is very much intermingled in a way that is just not what we have been led to believe that the world is like there. So I wanted to show that diversity. While Lebanese American was not as big in terms of miners, there were a lot of Lebanese merchants and professionals. There was a strong community in, especially in Wheeling, which is farther north. But, in Matewan today, which is where the book starts, Mount Lebanon Church, there's like a Mount Lebanon named like Mount Lebanon Baptist Church or something. It's right there outside of town. And so I wanted to really show that. And it really turns around how we think of the word redneck, too. Yeah. And there are people that are now kind of trying to re-own that word and say this has actually a very progressive, empowering history behind it, But over time, we can see how the victors kind of, to some degree, those in power tell the story. And the stories, some stories get buried and stories get twisted, and words even come to have different meanings. And so those were all things I was absolutely going for with this book to show. And they were very well documented. It's just, and it's amazing that we don't know a lot of this, right? I mean, to think 1 million rounds fired on American soil in 1921, and very few people have even heard of it. It's not been in film except for Matewan, John Sayles' Matewan, which had James Earl Jones and some other big folks, but that was in 1987. Denise Giordano's book, Storming Heaven, I think that was 1987. So not a whole lot has gotten this story out there. So those were all, things that I was thinking about,
You talked a moment ago about the real people who were in the book, Mother Jones, Sid Hatfield, your great-grandfather. And you talked a lot about your grandfather, but I'd love to know, about the other real people. How did you manage to keep the essence of them and not change who they were, especially since, there's so much written on some of them. How did you show what they stood for during their lives?
So I think it depended on the character. Someone like Mother Jones is fairly well documented, both in her own words, books of her speeches, and then biographies about her. And what I spent a lot of time doing was, one, in her own words, her autobiography, and two, reading her speeches to get her language and those kinds of things. And she, I think most people think of Mother Jones, they think of the publication today and they think of this great labor organizer, but they don't know her origin story. And that's one of the things that I really like to do, is go behind the scenes and see how she got there. And her story is just incredible. She came over from Ireland during the potato famine, they think 1847. She was a school teacher in Memphis. Her husband and I believe it was 3 children all died during yellow fever. So she's a school teacher. She loses her entire family like in her 30s. Has a restart over her life, goes to Chicago, becomes a dressmaker. There she begins to start having her seeing. I think her eyes are open. She's a dressmaker for all these like the rich people who live on like Lakeshore Drive in these mansions, and she just sees them ignoring like the people shivering outside on the street while she makes dresses that could feed that person for a year. Then the Great Chicago Fire happens, and she loses her dress shop, and she has to start all her life all over again. And at this point, I'm not sure how old she is, but she's, I think, in her 50s by that time. But she's kind of becoming radicalized by what she's seen, and so she goes to her first meeting of the Knights of Labor, early labor organization, and from then on, she always called the miners and the steel workers and all those folks, she called them her boys. And I think she really adopts workers. This becomes her, she's lost her family once. She's lost her life twice. And then she basically becomes, she says, my home is my shoes. She just lives on the road. And it's just unthinkable today, almost, in Rednecks. The West Virginia coal fields at this time are a very, very dangerous place. Most labor organizers went in armed. A lot of them were beaten. Some of them disappeared, were killed. Here's Mother Jones marching around, who's somewhere between like 83 and 90 at the time. She kind of maybe was trumping up her age a little bit more. But her 100th birthday party was in 1933. So this is 1921. She is she's past the age when a lot of people would have passed away in terms of lifespan at that time, and she's out facing down some of the hardest, meanest gun thugs in the basically hired guns of the coal companies around. And so she's just an amazing character, but most people don't know that origin story, her genesis and how she came to be. So I wanted to show that. And so I wanted to show her essence and where we have the Mother Jones of telling the speeches, which are incredible speeches, and her obvious, her delivery and her was very moving. But what we don't see very often is her private life. Things that seem like maybe panic attacks she's having, nerve problems, all of her health problems behind the scenes. So I wanted to show all that. And a character like Sid Hatfield, who's the police chief in Matewan, who's one of the few lawmen in the state to really stand up for the miners and not be put into the pockets of the coal companies. We know a lot about him as kind of a folk hero, but he hasn't been shown that much, and so I wanted to give some humanity to him, but also to mythologize him a little bit, because he deserves that. I mean, Sid Hatfield should be this folk hero that we don't really know about. And so that was kind of interesting to me to try to give that to him. And in some ways, Sid was probably, he's kind of a bad dude. He was the bad dude on the good side, but that's kind of what it took. He was the only person that made the other bad dudes think twice about coming to town. And he was the only one to turn down. The coal companies offered him $1,000 cash to put machine guns on the town rooftops in Matewan in case the miners got too unruly. And that would have bought 3 new cars, 3 new Ford Model Ts back then. And he told them basically where they could stick their money, And there weren't a whole lot of lawmen in the state at that time that were doing that. So, yeah, I found that I have over time now come to enjoy taking a historical figure that we think we know a little bit, going deep into their biography and trying to, obviously you're the one that I have to feel right about it. I have to feel that I am somewhat, sometimes I can and sometimes I can't. With Mother Jones and Sid Hatfield, I found like I found it, and I felt like the story I was telling about them was some thread of truth about them. Like I felt like I was tapped into that from what I'd read about them, from trying to get to know them. It's not always that case, and if I don't feel that I can do that, then I won't try to see a character like that from their perspective a little bit.
Is it not finding enough information, or just not having a feel for who they are and not wanting to create them as too far off of who they really were in real life?
I think it's both. I think it's also being sensitive about whether I feel that I'm in a position to be able to tell their story to some degree also. So it's all those things, but in the end, it's probably not something that I really intellectualize, it's instinct. Do I have the instinct that I have found this and that I can do this and that I want to be, that I can drop in with them? And I probably would be less likely to do it from a first-person perspective. Doing third-person perspective that's like limited omniscience, you're not quite as close, so it's a little bit easier to manage, I think. Sometimes not having much information is freeing because we don't know, so you do have more freedom to get in there with them. If we know too much about the figure, then I think that it's almost like that's more difficult. You need that mystery of behind the scenes, and for Mother Jones, she didn't really write about this time because she was kind of traumatized by her handling of it. So she says nuts, she ignores it in her autobiography. So we have a blank space to drop into with everything else we know, and to try to visit and see where she was. Does that make sense?
It does, and it strikes me that she kind of lost a third family, a third life, because she had she has very little influence on what her boys do. Mm-hmm. Not to give anything away, but yeah, and you mentioned something a moment ago about she was her home, which is heartbreaking. But you have this way of finding a phrase mm-hmm. that so clearly describes people mm-hmm. and situations, and I made a few notes because they're just brutal. They're brutal moments, but they're beautiful images. And one is the barrels of guns, barrels swaying like reeds in a stream. I love it. It's such a beautiful image, but the moment is so horrible. Mm-hmm. Another is when Musa, and Musa is Dot Mu's son, finds a friend out of loss of another person, and this is Musa and Moose. Moose is a dog, and their first touch is described as skull to sternum, and that's so beautiful. It's so intimate and personal, you know. How did you become a writer who can create these beautiful, heartfelt images and break our heart doing it?
I think that one thing that I didn't really think of when I wanted to be a writer as a child and young man, but I've come to realize is really one of the beautiful things about being a writer is that it really, you know, all the gurus tell us to be here now and to act without inattention, to notice the world around us, to be in the moment. And being a writer to some degree, I feel like, takes it a step further because it's like a mission, a warrant to do that. So I feel like a lot of it is keeping eyes open in daily life to these things and then bringing them to your work. So the skull to sternum is because I have a dog, Waylon, Highland. Waylon was my dog before that, but he does that. He walks up, and my partner or former partner, when she first got Highland from the pound, she got him because he walked up and did the same thing. He came up and he'll do this thing and he'll put his head down and he just pushes his head, the top of his head, into your chest. And I've never seen a dog do that. And so it's those moments, and then giving them the significance they have, I think, to some degree, and carrying them around with you until it's the right place for them to go. And another is just the style of writing. I think that I have always admired writers in writing that is full of images like that, has some poetry to it, that is trying to do that with the world and with images. And so it isn't, you know, it's also a way of writing, I think, that I am just drawn to, you know.
I have so many more questions, but I want to be able to give you an opportunity to ask questions. But I have one more question before we get there. So Frank is another character. He's another heart of this book, and I think maybe my favorite character in the book. And he and another man, Bonnie, notice, I won't give the situation away, but they notice a man up on a trestle, and that man spots dynamite, which has been placed there for a particular reason. And Frank is faced with a life or death situation, and he makes a comment. He says, "This must be how God feels." Will you talk more about Frank and
Sure.
Whatever you want to share about it?
So Frank is actually, Big Frank as they call him, is based on two real individuals. He's kind of a synthesis of two individuals. One is a man named Frank Ingham, who is an African-American union organizer. When Big Frank is assaulted in the book, that whole storyline, the way he's taken in and not booked, and the way that all happens runs very true to the story that Frank Ingham tells of it. But he's also a synthesis of a man named Dan Chain, also known as Few Clothes Johnson, who was a miner. Famously, they said he had arms like country hams, and you know, like his forearms, I think. And he was part of the Dirty 11, which was basically a miners' kind of guerrilla commando force from a decade before the Paint Creek mine war, and was a legendary figure. And so Big Frank is kind of a synthesis of those two. Even in Matewan, if you've ever seen the film, it's anachronistic because he's not from that era, but I believe James Earl Jones plays a character based on Few Clothes. But his path through the book is how we see someone, one, become radicalized as he, you know, I mean, he's a member of the union at first, but as things happen to him and he's pushed more and more into a corner, he really has very little choice but to become kind of a fugitive but on the same hand, I think that he goes through a moment, certainly he has a lot of anger, you know, which is very much, to me, valid anger for the life that he's lived and what's been done to him and to his loved ones. But there's also a sense that I almost feel like he kind of goes through that out the other side, where somehow that gives him a little bit more humanity in the end because of what he's seen and been through. Or maybe it's just a mark of character, because I do feel like he's just someone of good character, and those people exist, and that's who I felt like he was. But a lot of this, I have to say that I don't sit down and think, oh, this character is going to be this and this is going to be that. I mean, this is very much an organic process. These characters seem to have as much willpower of their own as I have as a writer, if not more so. Their behavior, I don't know whether Frank was going to fire or not. That's based somewhat on something that happened. That bridge was tried to be dynamited and burned, but I didn't know whether he was going to fire or not in that moment, right? And it's kind of like he has to choose. When they say this is how God feels, they really have to, they're choosing someone's fate, really. And whether they feel that they have the right to do that, even if they're going to prevent this person from something that's really destructive, maybe them losing this entire battle. And so it really is a moment, a decision like that. And I think it's also, well, if we make that decision, we're no better than the people on the other side. That's another question. I think that's all there. But so he's based on them, and to me, I wanted someone that was a miner, and you really see what they were faced with, and what would you do if this happened to you, and this happened to you, and this was your life, and this happened to you? What decision would you make when you were cornered a little bit, And just as a background, it is statistically, it's a real statistic, it's in the book, it was more dangerous to work in a West Virginia coal mine in this period than it was to fight in World War I. It was, you lived in company housing, you were paid in coal scrip, not legal tender, which you could only spend at the company store where the prices were jacked up. You had to buy your own supplies for use in the mines. Most of us still think of mines as being like a place that you could walk in, a coal mine. No, we're talking about mines that are sometimes 36 inches, and they were in there 10 to 12 hours a day, okay? They can't unionize, so they don't have any of the safety things that they should. There's another story that's in the book that's a real thing that I found that, one of the sayings was, why don't the mules a lot of the time had helmets? Because you have roof falls is one of the real dangerous things where the roof will fall in. And the miners weren't given helmets. They don't have enough to buy something like that. And the idea was, if a man dies, you can hire another one. If a mule dies, you have to buy one. And that was the way the company thought, right? And that was very much a story that was told. And sometimes it seems that, we still see that today. The machinery is treated better than the workers are. So there's a lot of parallels I felt like with this book, just that hit home, that felt this was almost exactly 100 years ago, and yet feels like, besides the setting and the technology, could have been happening right now. And literally people saying some of the same things that we hear today, it almost sounds like. So all of that was kind of fascinating to me. And why have we maybe not progressed in certain areas? Because these stories are not told, That's part of the problem, So that's all stuff I was kind of thinking about.
Let's see if anybody has any questions. Anybody have anything for Taylor? Well, I've got more questions if you want to percolate on it a little bit. So one of the things in the book that fascinated me and I just loved, you carried it through the book, as the possibles bag. Tell us what a possibles bag is. So possibles bag, I think I came across it during some level of research for this book. It was something that really started more in frontier times, and it was an early sling bag that an outdoorsman would carry all their possibles. So punky dope, which is like an old time like bug repellent. They're making tinder for making fires. All the possibles, the things that they might possibly need. Basically, and I just love the idea of this. I also kind of carry a possibles bag. I feel like I have, I ride my bicycle usually everywhere, and my backpack has enough, that I could kind of almost live out of it, all the necessities. So it probably struck me at that point, but there's a possibles bag that kind of carries all through the book and goes from, certain different people wearing it, and it trading hands a little bit. And, I don't know how I
I think the word, very much the word possibles bag, which I had not heard before, just stuck with me. And it also seems like there's some level of like hope with it that you can get by as long as you have your possibles bag, even if you're stranded. And Musa, of course, Doc Mu's son, who's one of my favorite characters, is this little kind of outdoorsman, little wild man. You know, he hates wearing shoes. He hates school clothes. He has his possibles bag, and he's very much his role grows throughout the book. So I very much associate the possibles bag with him. But I think it was the word itself. You know, sometimes you just find something in research, and a lot of the time, if you're doing historical work, it's something that's been lost from the language, like a possibles bag. And it just feels like you found this nugget that somehow has meaning. And I love, the little detective in me, kind of in the history nerd, loves to uncover these things. To me, it's almost like a going through the attic and finding something you never thought you would find, or digging for buried treasure and finding something. And so I feel like I find all these little nuggets, and I kind of write them down and store them away for use later.
Well, I just love the Possibles bag, and I love the way you carry it through the story, and it really binds people together. There's a beautiful moment with Musa and Frank. But before we end it all, I want to know if there's what's next. What can you tell us about what's next for you?
So I was just able to announce it. We have a novel that's going to come out from my same publisher in 2026. It's called Wolvers. And it is my first novel set outside of the South. It's set in the Gila Wilderness of New Mexico, which is the first federal wilderness, some say the first designated wilderness area in the world. Still not even bicycles are allowed. Horses and on your own 2 feet, only time you're allowed in there. It's in near the Arizona border and kind of midway down in New Mexico. But they reintroduced wolves there, Mexican wolves, in the late 90s. Now, most of folks now have heard of wolf reintroduction at Yellowstone. That's much more well known. And of course, right now, big in the news is that Colorado reintroduced wolves just about a little less than a year ago, I believe last December. But they reintroduced Mexican wolves there at a time. They think that there were fewer than 50 of these wolves left, period. And the wolves start turning up dead. There are a lot of people that don't like this idea of wolves being, back. And so it's a book it is a little bit different for me because it does go back to one of my things that I've always been interested in, animals and writing about animals. There's a little bit less of that in Rednecks simply because of the story. But I'm a little bit excited too because it's different for me in that it's in the Southwest and not in the Southeast or Appalachia. And it's all contemporary, although it brings in a lot of the history of the area, as a lot of my things do. And one of the main characters is a she-wolf, which is a little different. And I've tried very hard to get all of the biology and animal behavior stuff right in a way that I don't think we see in fiction a lot. And I like to take stories, I know we have 1 minute left, I like to take stories like this to tell you a story that is the real story you haven't been told. And that this is going to do that with wolves themselves, I think, which have been villainized from medieval times, and very much so don't deserve a lot of that villainization. And very much, I think it's very well researched to show that. And so, yeah, I'm excited about 2026.
Well, congratulations. We look forward to it. Thank you, Louisiana Book Festival. Thank you all for coming. And thank you, Taylor Brown. I've been looking forward to this conversation for a long time.
Thank you so much, Jeffrey. This was great fun. Thank you.